November 12, 1944, RAF Woodbridge on the east coast of England. The fog was so dense it felt solid, a grey wall pressing in on the runway lights. Out of that murk, a B-17 Flying Fortress, tail number 4231407, suddenly appeared as if it had been conjured out of nothing. One main gear leg dangled halfway down while the other sagged uncertainly. Number 4 engine on the outer right wing was dead and feathered. The hydraulic gauge sat on 0. In the left seat, First Lieutenant Thomas Crawford stared at a situation no checklist had ever prepared him for. The landing gear was half extended and not locked, visibility was almost non-existent, and he had 8 men in the fuselage behind him who would almost certainly die if he guessed wrong. Either he found some way to put this crippled bomber on the ground without it cartwheeling into a fireball, or his crew would not see another sunrise. The radio in the cockpit crackled with panic from the Woodbridge control tower. Crawford, negative. Abort. Abort. Do not attempt landing. Crawford's answer was calm, almost casual. Tower, I'm out of options. Gear won't lock. I'm coming in tail first. There was stunned silence on the frequency. Crawford, you're insane. You'll cartwheel the aircraft. Maybe, he replied, but my crew walks away. What followed over the next 4 minutes would force Allied air forces to rewrite their emergency landing procedures. It began with the most dangerous decision a pilot can make: to deliberately ignore doctrine, instinct, and everything printed in the manual and fly backwards into the fog. This is how barracks jokes about backwards Tom turned into a control tower full of shocked silence, how a crew who had quietly accepted they were already dead stepped off a bomber on their own legs, and how one impossible maneuver became legend. Thomas Crawford had been preparing for that moment his entire life without realizing it. He grew up in the broad valleys of Montana, where winter fog didn't simply settle. It flowed between the mountains like a white river. His father flew crop dusters for a living, skimming low over fields, trusting feel and judgment even more than the instruments bolted to the panel. That was flying by nerve endings and common sense. Read the air, read the ground, trust your hands. Tom absorbed all of it. By 22, he had already logged more than 800 hours. By 24, he wore U.S. Army Air Force's wings and flew B-17s over Germany. His crew trusted him because he never looked shaken. Fighters, flak, and filthy weather came and went, and Crawford flew as if he were following a story he already knew the ending to. They had started calling him Backwards Tom well before the tail-first landing, but not because of anything he did in an airplane. The nickname came from their nightly poker games. Crawford refused to play cards the way anyone expected. He would fold apparently unbeatable hands without a second thought, then shove all his chips forward on cards that looked worthless. He played reverse odds, making moves that made no sense until they paid off. One night, his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Mike Jennings, finally asked him why. Crawford shrugged. In poker and in flying, he said, everybody assumes you're going to keep moving straight ahead. Sometimes the only winning move is the one no one thinks you'll try. November 12, 1944, began like dozens of other gray, cold mornings in East Anglia. The crew of 423-1407 filed into the briefing room before dawn, coffee in hand, eyes heavy. Cigarette smoke hung in the air as operations officers pulled back the map curtain. The target was the Merseburg oil refineries deep in Germany, another blow aimed at the fuel that kept the German war machine running. The force would be massive, 824 B-17s with nearly 3,000 escort fighters assigned. Crawford's ship, nicknamed Rocky Mountain High, was on its 28th combat mission. The same crew had flown all but one of those sorties together. If they could survive 3 more, they would rotate home. That knowledge made them cautious and methodical, the particular kind of careful you see in men who are fully aware they are already living on borrowed time. The crew complement was the textbook 9-man team plus their pilot. Jennings sat in the right seat as co-pilot and handled radios and checklists. Navigator Lieutenant Dan Morrison kept them on track with maps and dead reckoning. Lieutenant James Sterling, the bombardier, guarded the Norden bomb site like sacred equipment. Flight engineer and top turret gunner Sergeant Frank Delgado watched the engines and fuel systems. Radio operator Sergeant Bill Ali managed the constant traffic on the airwaves. Ball turret gunner Sergeant Eddie Kowalski curled up in the glass sphere under the belly. Waist gunners Sergeants Tommy Lou and Carl Henderson stood at the side window .50 caliber guns. Tail gunner Sergeant Marcus Washington crouched alone in the rear, eyes always fixed on the 6 o'clock position. They trusted Crawford because, when things got violent, he did not yank the aircraft around. Under flak and fighter attacks, he flew with smooth, decisive hands, as if violent reactions only made things worse. Takeoff at 5:47 was routine. Engines roared, wheels left the ground, and Rocky Mountain High climbed into the dim sky to join the massive bomber stream forming over the North Sea. In the gray dawn, the ships assembled into neat boxes. Crawford slid his Fortress into its place in the high squadron exactly as the board had prescribed. They crossed the Dutch coastline at 14,000 feet. The world below disappeared under an unbroken white blanket of cloud. Intelligence estimates had promised light resistance. That assessment lasted until 8:47, about 50 miles from the target, when the first formation of German fighters dropped in. Bf-109s dove out of the upper cloud deck in disciplined formations, not going after single stragglers but whole boxes of bombers. A moment later, FW-190s followed, their 20mm cannons flashing. Very quickly, the sky filled with pieces of burning aluminum. At 8:51, Crawford's squadron took the first hit. The Fortress ahead of Rocky Mountain High took a cannon burst straight into the bomb bay. The entire aircraft erupted in a fireball and broke apart in midair, leaving only tumbling fragments. Crawford banked hard right, sliding his aircraft under the expanding cloud of wreckage with barely 30 feet of clearance. Before the crew had time to fully process what they had just seen, the flak batteries below joined the attack. Black puffs of exploding shells began blossoming at exactly the bomber's altitude, calculated by gunners who had spent years perfecting their craft. The Fortress shuddered and rattled. Metal shrieked as fragments ripped through skin and stringers. From the cramped ball turret, Kowalski's voice cut in. "Bandits at 6. Washington twisted his turret around and squeezed the triggers. The twin .50 calibers thundered. Lines of tracers arced into the swirling mess of fighters behind them. An FW-190 rolled inverted and came straight down their line of flight. From the waist, Tommy Lou hosed a stream of fire across its wing route. The German fighter disappeared in a burst of flame, but two more were already setting up their runs. Crawford shoved the nose forward, dropping the bomber 500 feet in 3 seconds. The crew felt their stomachs float and their harnesses bite into their shoulders. That abrupt move ruined the carefully built German attack geometry. The fighters streaked past too low to get proper shots and had to climb away and reorganize. "Nice flying, Skipper," Jennings said softly. Crawford didn't answer. He was studying the battered formations ahead of him, subconsciously counting just how many B-17s were missing. For aircraft gone in just 2 minutes. The mission was coming apart under him. At 9:12 they reached the initial point and turned to line up on the target. Morrison called out, "Heading 350. Hold steady." From that moment until bombs were away, the bombardier effectively flew the airplane. Sterling took control through the Norden bomb site. The formation had to fly straight and level, no weaving, no jinking. To the flak batteries below, every Fortress was now a predictable target. The shell bursts multiplied. More and more explosions went off right at their height. The B-17 rocked with the impacts of near misses. Shrapnel tore through sheet metal in a constant metallic clatter. Then one 88mm round did not miss. It detonated directly under the belly of the ship. The big bomber bucked upward as if a giant hand had slapped it. In the bomb bay, shards of steel scythed through hydraulic lines. Red fluid sprayed across the narrow catwalk. "Hydraulics!" Delgado shouted. "We're losing pressure fast." Crawford flicked his glance to the gauge and watched the needle racing toward zero. No hydraulics meant they had no brakes, no power to extend flaps, and, most critically, no way to lock the landing gear once it dropped. The mains might fall from gravity, but they would be free to collapse under load. It was the sort of problem you filed away for later. First, they had to escape Merseburg alive. "Bombs away," Sterling called at 9:18. The fortress jolted a bit lighter as 4,000 pounds of high explosives separated from the racks and fell toward the oil refineries below. Crawford took the yoke back and eased the aircraft into its turn off the target. The flak crews below simply adjusted their aim and kept firing. At 9:24, another shell burst near the outer right engine. Number 4 shuddered, coughed, and then burst apart in a spray of oil and debris. "Number 4's gone," Delgado yelled. Crawford responded automatically, feathering the ruined propeller so it wouldn't rip itself and the wing apart. They were down to 3 engines, still technically flyable. At 9:31, just short of the German border, a trailing Bf-109 raked their right wing with cannon fire before the gunners beat it off. The rounds punched through the fuel tanks, and gasoline streamed out behind the wing in a shimmering sheet. In the radio room, Ali and Delgado scrambled to transfer whatever fuel they could from the damaged right side tanks into the left, trying to save every usable gallon and keep some kind of balance. Jennings ran quick numbers on his kneeboard and came up with an ugly answer. "Skipper," he said quietly, "at this burn rate, we don't make it back to England." Crawford didn't need a pencil to know he was right. The question was no longer how to go home, but where to accept they might die. Over open water? Over German-occupied territory? Or in a desperate attempt to land at an English emergency strip with almost no visibility and unreliable landing gear? By 10:47, they crossed the English Channel coast inbound. Somewhere ahead lay runways and safety, but the countryside was completely hidden. Fog from the North Sea had rolled inland in a solid gray wall, swallowing everything. Crawford eased the B-17 down into the soup on instruments only. At 5,000 feet, they briefly broke out into a clear pocket and saw hints of fields and trees. 12 seconds later, they were back in cloud. "Woodbridge Tower, this is Rocky Mountain High," Crawford transmitted. "Declaring emergency. Hydraulics gone. Landing gear unstable. Visibility 0. Request immediate clearance for landing." Woodbridge was one of the long, wide emergency landing fields built specifically for damaged heavy bombers. The tower came back tense. "Rocky Mountain, divert to Manston. Better visibility there." "Negative tower," Crawford replied. "Fuel is critical. We get one shot at this. Request foam on the runway." After a pause, the controller answered. "Copy, Rocky Mountain High. Foam trucks are deploying. Wind calm. Visibility 100 feet or less. You are cleared for emergency approach. Runway 27. Crawford brought the fortress down to about 800 feet. Outside, there was only textureless gray. No horizon. No reference. At roughly 400 feet, Jennings spotted a faint smear of runway lights ahead and slightly right. "There, skipper. Come right a little." Crawford adjusted with a touch of aileron and rudder. Then the gear warning horn shrieked across the cockpit. Delgado double-checked the indicators. Main gear dropped, but both lights are red. They're not locked. Gravity had dragged the wheels down, but with hydraulics dead, the locking mechanism had not engaged. The moment 3 tons of aircraft weight hit the pavement, those struts would almost certainly fold and send the B-17 slamming nose down into a cartwheeling mess. Belly landing with half-extended gear would be worse, guaranteed to dig in and flip the bomber. Bailing out at such low altitude in fog meant a good portion of the crew would never have a chance for their parachutes to fully open. For a heartbeat, only the engine noise and the warning horn filled the cockpit. Then a memory surfaced in Crawford's mind. Winter in Montana, a crippled crop duster. His father easing it down tail low into a snow-covered field so that the soft snow and tail wheel took the first shock. "Tower," he said into his mic. "I'm going to try something unconventional." "Say again, Rocky Mountain," came the incredulous reply. "I'm reversing the approach. Tail first landing. More static. Repeat, Rocky Mountain. Did you say tail first?" "I'll bring her in backwards," Crawford explained calmly. "We'll touch the tail wheel first. Let the fuselage settle forward. By the time the mains hit, we'll have bled off speed. Less impact on the gear." The controller almost sounded angry. "Lieutenant, that's madness. You'll cartwheel and break apart." "Maybe," Crawford repeated, "but it's the only shot we've got." He did not wait for any further argument from people who were standing on solid ground. At around 200 feet, he pulled the power back and let the airspeed fall toward 90 knots, just above where the big bomber would stall. The controls felt soft and sluggish. He fed in rudder and a touch of aileron, sliding the nose sideways in a steep slip. In a normal slip, pilots cross control to show more fuselage and bleed speed. Crawford kept going until the airplane was moving almost sideways relative to where its nose pointed. The tail now effectively led the way toward the unseen runway, the nose angled 30 degrees off. "Everybody brace," he told the crew over intercom. "We're landing backwards." No one objected. After 27 missions, they would have followed him into a tornado. In the tail, Washington suddenly had a better view than anyone. "Skipper, approach lights dead ahead out my window," he called. "We're drifting a little left." Crawford added a hint more rudder. The bomber eased back toward the centerline, tail aimed at the bright blur of foam-covered concrete, nose still angled into cleaner air for a bit of lift. Any ordinary flight instructor would have failed a trainee instantly for such a maneuver. Crawford was no longer flying a textbook. He was flying pure physics, mass, momentum, friction, and time. At about 100 feet, the small tail wheel touched the runway foam. It was more of a bump than a crash. Crawford held the control column neutral, allowing gravity and drag to bring the nose down gradually. The Fortress slid tail first through the slick foam, decelerating. 30 knots. 20. As the nose settled, the partially extended main gear swung closer to the runway. By the time the mains finally carried weight, Rocky Mountain High had slowed to around 60 knots, roughly half normal landing speed. The weakened gear struts flexed and groaned, but they did not collapse. The bomber rolled forward another couple hundred feet, nose finally dropping to a normal attitude, engines at idle, until it came to rest in a cloud of foam and steam. For a few long seconds, nobody in the cockpit spoke. Then Jennings turned slowly toward Crawford. "You just landed a B-17 backwards," he said. Crawford reached up and pulled the mixture controls back to cut the engines. The 4 big radials stuttered and fell silent. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Let's not make a habit of it." On the radio, the tower controller's voice shook. "Rocky Mountain High, you are down. Emergency crews are on their way." That was, I don't even have words. "Tower, we're shutting down," Crawford replied. "Crew is walking out." And they did. All 9 of them. Crawford led the way out the side window, followed by Jennings and the rest, each man dropping into foam-soaked mud. They turned back to look at their airplane. The Fortress sat at an odd angle, tail squatting low, nose pointing skyward at perhaps 20 degrees, like it had tried to back itself into an invisible hangar. The main gear legs were bent and warped but still upright. Foam clung to everything. Delgado suddenly began to laugh. At first it was a helpless little chuckle. Then it grew until it shook his entire body. Lou joined him, then Henderson. Within moments the entire crew found themselves doubled over, laughing hysterically in the fog. It was the wild laughter of men who had been sure they were already dead and were only now beginning to believe they were alive. Fire trucks and ambulances burst out of the mist, sirens wailing, tires squealing on the wet runway. Ground crews piled out expecting to see wreckage and bodies. Instead they found 9 grinning airmen and a bomber that looked like it had parked itself backwards. The base commander, Colonel Richard Hayes, pushed through the gathering crowd. He looked at the skid marks carved through the foam, at the absurd posture of the Fortress, at Crawford standing there holding his flight helmet. "Lieutenant," he said slowly, "did you just land that aircraft tail first?" "Yes, sir," Crawford replied. "That's impossible," Hayes said. Crawford glanced back at the bomber, then back at his commander. "Apparently not, sir." Hayes studied him for a long moment, then a smile began to spread across his face. "You've just rewritten my emergency procedures," he said. "I honestly don't know whether I should court-martial you or put you in for a medal." "I'd rather have the medal, sir," Crawford answered. This time the laughter came not just from the crew but from the entire ring of ground personnel, medics, and firemen. Everyone there had listened in on the radio. Every one of them had been braced to find a smoking crater. Instead, they had a bomber perched tail low like a stubborn mule that refused to fall over. That night, the nickname Backwards Tom took on an entirely new meaning. Within 3 days, the story appeared in Stars and Stripes. The photo showed Crawford and his crew standing proudly by Rocky Mountain High, the B-17 clearly resting tail low.